welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I have a special treat for you. My friend Brandan Buck is not only a recent veteran of the Afghanistan War, he is a writer and academic who studies the anti-war movement on the right and war propaganda through the 20th and 21st centuries. Brandan is a PhD candidate in history and a graduate research assistant with the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University here in the outskirts of Washington. He is also a self-professed conservative non-interventionist. Brandan, thank you for coming on my show today.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I should correct you on one sense. I am not a recent veteran of the War on Terror. I'm a very much old veteran of the War on Terror. So it's been 20 years since I've
oh my goodness. That's my fault. I always consider guys and gals who were in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as recent veterans.
Yeah.
I guess I got to stop doing that.
And it's funny because my experiences there were considerably different than those who got out, because I went back to Afghanistan from 2011 to 2013, and it was like a whole different war, a whole different environment, so.
Still, you are a veteran and you know of what you speak. And that's what I really appreciate about you and all of your work that you've done since then in terms of like the work on the historical lens on the anti-war movement, as well as propaganda and the forces and dynamics that have gotten us into wars or have garnered the support of the American people for wars. I appreciate that because you're looking through a specific experienced lens. So thank you. So anyway, I would like to talk first about a piece that you did for Responsible Statecraft. It was last year, but it's very salient today. It was a piece called "Feeling Manipulated: How Uncle Sam Perfected the Information State." And in it, you pointed out that U.S. government efforts to manipulate the narrative and whip Americans up for support in war, including deploying tools of censorship, began really on the grandest scale in World War I. You wrote, and I'm going to quote from the article now, you say, "To achieve this end, the president created the Committee for Public Information via executive order and appointed political ally and former investigative journalist George Creel to lead it. According to historian John Maxwell Hamilton, this CPI, quote, shot propaganda through every capillary in the American bloodstream. Creel's organization proliferated pro-Allied and xenophobic anti-German messaging through its press releases, the covert subsidizing of newspapers, public speakers, and even church sermons. The CPI pressured American media to censor news and coordinated with other government agencies, including the Postal Service, to restrict dissident content. In addition to boosting the U.S. government's position on the war, the CPI amplified the domestic threat of German agents, framed calls for negotiated peace as, quote, spy talk, and pressured newspaper editors who considered running articles critical of the war into forging publication. Brandan, can you tell us more about this? Because I think to most Americans today, this part of the sordid history of World War I has receded well into the mists. And, we know that it has a lot of implications for how the government has sort of shaped our thinking and support for wars beyond World War I.
Yes, so the first iteration of the information state during World War I was certainly its most coercive and that of its most of its heaviest hand. In addition to the instruments of censorship, there was also the Sedition Act, in which the government jailed something like 1,600 war resistors, people who opposed the draft, and more perniciously, it took active participation of American citizens to implement. It often wasn't just the agents of the state cracking people over the head. It was vigilantes. It was volunteers carrying a lot of the dirty work. So, with that piece and with some of my other writing, I constantly wanted to remind people that the war always begins at home. the efforts of the Wilson administration and also subsequent administrations to lay the groundwork for intervention often, almost always precedes the actual, start of hostilities with whatever foreign power is in question. And so this certainly happened in World War One. There was, absolutely, there was, one of the reasons why, German Americans are an almost invisible minority in this country is because their ethnic identity was actively suppressed, not only by the state but also by their private vigilante actors. I mean, I often tell people this, but my own last name was changed by my two times great grandfather on the eve of World War II. He was a German American living in Baltimore. Changed it from Bach to Buck to escape, being harassed or killed. People were lynched.
Wow.
Not only German Americans, but also like labor activists, people on the left. The federal government used its powers to crush the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and other sort of radical unions. But also coming out of that, there came a greater expectation of American civil liberties, because whereas the state had typically used its powers on anarchists and other left-wing radicals, that for the first time any member of any John or Jane Q public could find themselves on the receiving end of a nightstick. So coming out of World War I, there was a higher expectation of American civil liberties, and there was this notion that it was to protect individuals, not just society at large. So once we get to the second iteration of the information state with World War II, FDR recognizes this and decides to take a much lighter touch and work through intermediaries in the press, and also use more covert means, like the FBI, and working with British intelligence to achieve the same ends.
So just getting back to World War I, what was the messaging there? I mean, you mentioned the anti-German sentiment, but how was the war framed so that regular Americans were on board and didn't question why the United States was going to war at the time?
Well, frankly, much like today, or much like later wars, it's a bundle of messaging. It's both idealistic and existential. This is a war for democracy, but it's also framed as being personal, right? I think we've all seen the messages of the Hun depicted as a gorilla, with a half naked woman in his arms, and there's often this notion that if we don't fight them, if we don't beat them over there, they're going to come over here. And then there's also appeals to American self-interest in terms of the Zimmerman telegram and earlier machinations of the German Empire in the Western Hemisphere. So the propaganda could be tuned to depending upon which audience was being targeted. But there was also, as we said earlier, there was this amplification of the alleged home front threat. Of course, there were German agents in the United States, there were German saboteurs, but you also have to remember the United States by 1915 certainly was a pseudo-belligerent in the war, right? But it only makes sense that if you're arming one side of the war, that the other is going to have a desire to impact that. So these incremental steps, sort of this pseudo-belligerency allows the state to ramp up either its overt or covert manipulation of people's thinking.
And how was the U.S. Postal Service used in this regard?
Well, the Postal Service has often been used as a means of censorship, because you got to think that this is the days before the radio, days before television, and so as far as print goes, it's one of the best ways to censor people is make it illegal to use the mail, because it's interstate. And so you can use federal authority in that way. And so people like from the CPR or British intelligence would read these things, and then they would pass that off to the Postal Service, and then use that as a means to prevent the interstate transfer of said materials. So, wow.
And direct meddling in newspapers.
Yep. I mean, well, direct is it's less direct than that. It's basically getting people on board by either sort of co-opting friendly outlets or using social pressure to frame other other outlets as being either enemy agents or in league or like useful dupes. I mean, as far as print goes, the heaviest hand was through the use of the post office.
Wow, it sounds a little familiar, but then you said in World War II, a lighter touch was employed. Can you talk a little bit about propaganda in World War II?
Yes. So, George Creel was still alive by the time World War II started, and he actually counseled FDR to bring back the CPI, and FDR declined. And so instead, he decided to work through intermediaries, particularly, and friendly press outlets. It's a common myth that the corporate press has always been a liberal, hegemon. That hasn't always been the case. In FDR's day, he did deal with a lot of hostile print media, but he had most of radio on side. And so, once the United States starts to take a more interventionist line into the war, particularly after the fall of France, FDR is able to call on a network that he had built up over the previous two administrations to get out positive messaging about American aid, first to Great Britain but then the Soviet Union, and also to amp up domestic fears of a fifth column. And he was able to do this because he had personal connections to people either in the press or in organizations, pro-interventionist organizations that did. And so he was able to basically pace the media, so to coordinate his private position with their public position, to create a sense of public desire for greater intervention, and therefore able to allow him with the image of being pushed into it. Whereas privately he was much more interventionist than his language publicly.
And the Brits, too, were engaging in propaganda directed towards the United States in those early years before Pearl Harbor, right?
Yep, much like World War I, they did so under the complete understanding of the White House, and also coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Again, they coordinated messaging with friendly outlets in the American press. They also, put agent provocateurs into meetings of the America First Committee, infiltrated groups to try to steal derogatory information and then leak that to the press, and also, amplify, some of the seedier or more controversial aspects of the America First Committee. I think Charles Lindbergh's speech in Des Moines, Iowa, and those kinds of things. So, we think of at the time, it was called the Great Debate, right? And as I point out in some of my work, this is not like a above board, debate of the merits of entering World War II. This was a manipulated marketplace of ideas in which, one side had an almost monopoly on the coercive powers of the state, but also just the influence of American media. And it's interesting because at the end of World War I, the acknowledgement of this came out. So like people knew about the CPI, they knew about British intelligence, and it caused a massive swell of opposition, and also a kind of revisionist view of the First World War. But knowledge of the Second World War and what went on with both the federal government and the British intelligence did not come out to many decades later.
Wow.
And so 1961, I think, is when the first memoir came out. One of the British agents who did these things, he wrote a memoir, and then it wasn't until the Church and Pike commissions that in the mid 70s that knowledge of what the U.S. government was doing through the FBI came out. But by then, right, the British Empire was dead. The U.S. was now the world's leading superpower, and the U.S. was involved in the Cold War. So the landscape for these revelations was pretty barren. So but now in a different geopolitical environment with 20 years of cynicism and the malaise of the global war on terror, the environment looks a lot more like World War I in its immediate aftermath than say in the aftermath of World War II.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why does it look more like World War I today? Are you talking specifically about, say, the Twitter files? and some of the disinformation campaigns that have been launched with quasi-governmental backing against dissent?
Well, I mean that, but I also mean like popular American willingness to entertain the idea that the United States government is a duplicitous actor in this way, right? I mean, in the aftermath of World War II and the glow of that victory, it was not capable to think about entry into the war in that way. But now, with in the wake of the Global War on Terror, with the American economy like the way that it is, and with the American political landscape, people are much more receptive to the notion that that we're not exactly being told the entire truth, to put it
Correct.
mildly. But again, the iteration of the information state has gotten even lighter still, and they're not. I tweeted out this morning, there's no chance that you're going to be lynched, for not buying Liberty bonds, but nonetheless, the manipulation of the media environment, it's corrosive to the institutions that the interventionists claim that they want to uphold, right? If I'm essentially not allowed to have an opinion on the most important questions facing this nation, then are we truly a democratic state? The impulses, the earlier impulses, like the darker ones of World War One or later, are they're held at bay because the institutions have not yet, brought those to the fore. But I think we would be remiss to believe that we've truly put those darker sides of ourselves away.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that's why I mentioned the Twitter files. Can you talk a little bit about how what we've seen through Russiagate, what we've seen through the systematic government meddling into social media ahead of the elections, the 2020 elections, which was revealed through the excellent reporting of Matt Taibbi and others that we call the Twitter files now, the efforts to normalize this idea of disinformation as a way to crack down on dissidents, an entire cottage industry of disinformation analysts and instructors and consultants and data miners. And can you talk a little bit about how this has sort of replaced those first two eras of government propaganda, and maybe talk a little bit about how pernicious you see that, even with this skepticism that Americans now have of the government information operations, but these are pretty vigorous attempts to continue to shape the messaging.
So parenthetically, I would just like to start, I'm old enough to remember, the earliest revelations of Silicon Valley being in bed with the national security state, and how this was a liberal project. We were appalled by this, right? Because the George W. Bush administration was apparently, in bed with Silicon Valley, but now all of a sudden the shoe is on the other foot, and we suddenly don't care anymore, or a lot of us don't seem to care anymore. One of the interesting things is I'm just sort of speculating here, is I think this the disinformation industrial complex knows that they can't get all the horses back on the barn, but if they can pick off certain nodes in the network, they can cause a cascading effect throughout. And one of the interesting things is seeing how narratives are conflated. I got into an exchange with some rando on Twitter yesterday, and basically it was equating legitimate, demonstrably false conspiracy theories like the CIA causes earthquakes, right, with this notion that the intelligence community interferes in domestic affairs. And oh my God, this is so insane. But they're not the same, right? This is a kind of Mott and Bailey strategy. It's used to tar everyone outside of the Overton window as being in the same ideological category. And unfortunately, it's effective for people, casual news consumers, right? This notion that NATO expansion as being a precursor to the current war, and after the invasion by the Russians in Ukraine, as being disinformation. Well, that's an opinion, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
not disinformation. That is an assessment based on evidence. But the supposed disinfo police can lump that in with demonstrable Russian disinformation and create this conflation that wouldn't otherwise exist, and which didn't exist before the war. This is something that, there's plenty of tape of people, including then Senator Joe Biden, talking about this being a red line. But now that the war started, it can be moved into this new ideological category and made to be radioactive.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's become so hyper politicized as well. I mean, the whole Russiagate phenomenon, in which the Democrats have created a huge narrative, an overarching narrative that the Russians had colluded with Donald Trump to win the 2016 election over Hillary Clinton. So you sort of seeded SEED. This ground with hearty skepticism of Russian intentions, which that whole scenario has been debunked in reality. But building upon that has been this whole idea that the Russians have continuously tried to meddle in our elections, shape the messaging in our elections, have literally interfered in the polling at state level, also debunked, but altogether has created this idea that we need these quasi-government agencies to come in and sort of monitor news, monitor social media, moderate how we're talking to each other about these issues, because it's somehow Russia. And I find that super pernicious. Another term that Matt Taibbi likes to point out that these disinformation agents like to use is malinformation.
Yeah, right.
Which it's not even inaccurate. It's actually real and truthful information, but it's not used in quite the right context. And they are the ones who are determining what is the right context, but they don't like how it's being used to persuade people. And so, yeah, there's layers upon layers of different types of disinformation, so to speak, that could lead to real legalistic penalties. We've seen that on college campuses today about what is hate speech and what leads to hate speech or violent speech or a speech that we just don't agree with, but yet could end up in someone being expelled or censored, suspended from school, not getting their degree, ripped off a campus by a cop. So it could have real life implications in terms of like the person vocalizing speech that the government says is wrong or bad or disinformation.
Yeah, and this is another one of those like rhetorical sleights of hand that the interventionists will use. They'll say, like, well, we're not making it illegal. It's like, yeah, of course, but you're using the levers of the therapeutic state to influence your will outside the confines of the law. It's like, don't pee on my shoe and tell me it's not raining, or tell me it's raining. But
Yeah.
yet those are the levers in which they use it. It is just kind of informal power. And another, it's even if you wanted to steel man, them, their arguments such as they are, Putin or Xi or whatever nefarious foreign actor you want to highlight is pushing on an open door, and they're doing so for a reason, right? There's a reason why people's faith in American institutions is in the toilet. I mean, it's 20 years of war. It's the financial crash. It's the financialization of the economy. It's offshoring. Pick whatever you want. And people have been living through these very real experiences, and foreign actors can serve as a foil, as a villain to paper over some very real concerns about people's material conditions. And in some ways, this is what happened in the interwar period, like because of the threat of Nazism overseas and Imperial Japan, we just completely forgot about all the excesses of the past, of the previous World War. And so I think, and it's debatable about how cynical these actors really are, but because of this new great power threat, such as it is, we're just going to sweep under the rug the last 20 years, and playing up this this alleged fifth column is a very effective way for them to do that.
Yeah, and as we've seen, our President Biden in his speech in Philadelphia, I believe it was right before the 2022 midterm elections, in which he called out MAGA Republicans as being anti-democratic, basically anti-American, and conflated that a bit, not only with the domestic issues that were going on at the time, but not sufficient enough support for Ukraine against the Russian aggression. And so basically signaling to everybody, if you're not on board with the US policy in Ukraine, that somehow you're pro-Putin, you're pro-authoritarian, you're definitely anti-American, but you might be anti-democracy, entirely. So I feel like he was taking that sort of McCarthyite step of basically warning everybody, not just the conservatives or the MAGA Republicans, but those independents and maybe even those on the left who are getting tired of the war in Ukraine, or at least are supporting it not actually leading to an end to the war, but actually more suffering from Ukrainians. And so the signal was, hey, if you're not on board with my policy, then you might just be MAGA. You might just be pro-Putin. And and it wasn't even that subtle, but I feel like that smear has really been deployed over the last couple of years, and now we see on the same coin flipped with the way that hawkish pro-Israel Republicans are talking about the left and any critics of U.S. policy in Gaza as well. So it's deployed on both left and right when it's politically convenient.
Oh yes, I mean it's one of the articles one of the past pieces I've written, and I'm not the only one to write on this, is what's called the scare cycle, right? That the interwar period, particularly the late interwar period, creates a fear of fascism in America, a brown scare, right, for brown shirts, and some of the archetypes of some of the targets of that then go and then create the second red scare because they want payback for the brown scare. And then yet again, one of the reasons why Kennedy runs to the right of Nixon, people forget this, in 1960, is because he wants to get payback for his people being called weak on communism, right? So this creates a second brown scare in the 1960s, and this cycle kind of eventually unspools itself once you get Reagan into power and there's truly a consensus on the Cold War. But this desire to paint one's opponents as being enemy agents is seemingly back in fashion. And it's you ever feel like you're the only person that hasn't been in a coma since 2002 or 2001? Like I remember, when it was your prototypical Fox News father-in-law who would rail about you're either with us or against us, right? And this idea was lambasted by the center left, but now that the shoe is on the other foot, we're supposed to forget that this is a bad thing, apparently. And it's funny because people who actually support this change in rhetoric will point, it was the conservatives back then who the ones who were using. True, some of them, but like the people have been consistent on this since then, right? Like the folks at the American Conservative have long been talking about the costs with American empire, one of them being this notion to bring the war home and cast your own neighbors, your own family. And this is what's one of the awful things about this is like it creates real incentives to write people out of your life, and I think that's terrible. And the fact that we can't talk about that is absurd, especially for a country that claims to be a democracy.
Yeah, it's been very disturbing over the last several months with Israel Gaza because no matter what you think about the actual conflict, seeing America again torn apart over the politicization of a war that's happening half a world away. This idea that if you are against wokeism on college campuses, that you're already geared towards, fearing the left and socialism and all the stuff that you see on Fox News, and then so somehow that's going to guide how you feel about Palestinians and Israelis in Gaza. So you cannot possibly look at this with an independent mind and say, and determine how you feel about U.S. policies in Israel. It has to be dictated by a domestic checklist of how you should feel about, Democrats and progressives and college students on woke campuses, and vice versa. And I just feel like, geez, can we just kind of sit back for a few moments, learn about an issue, decide whether it's in America's best interests to support Israel in Gaza, and determine it by like sort of like an informed thinking about foreign policy, as opposed to, oh well, I'm going to have to feel about this because this checks my box on my domestic political values, and my identity politics, really.
Yeah, it's I think like a lot of people in the restrainer space, my timeline on Twitter, it was torn in half after October 7th with people who were otherwise quite dovish, or at least non-interventionist of one stripe or other, become quite hawkish on the Israeli side, and then most of them were probably far more pro-Palestinian. Like watching, this is the like the it's like the Scott Adams thing about there being two movies on one screen. Like, these are very large protests with a lot of also counter protesters, and you're always going to be able to find some ne'er-do-well in either group that is clearly outside the bounds of the Overton window. But it's the incentives are lined up to amplify those on
Right.
on either end, and not have any kind of substantive debate about the issues at hand. Watching these campus protests, I have to sort of correct a prediction that I made. Like, historians should never make predictions, and unfortunately I made one. Is that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was of the opinion that there wasn't going to be an ideological force to get a consensus again on America's role in the world in the absence of terrorism or communism or fascism. But now it seems like Israel-Palestine might do just that, at least with conservatives. Get enough of them on side to create a consensus on whatever this new emerging world order will be, because there will be a lot of conservatives, and frankly most people on the center left, to be supportive of Israel regardless of the facts or whatever America's interests are, because we can't even really talk about what America's interests are, right? It's the global international order, it's global democracy, it's all of these platitudes. Even the idea that the United States exists and therefore has interests is anathema to most of the opinion molders in Washington. Right? You're either a multilateralist hawk or you're a unilateralist hawk who wants to bring the rest of the world along with you in your wake. So, unfortunately, it's going to be a very narrow window of debate.
Well, I'm glad we have conservatives like you and thinkers like you, not just conservative, but an American who's thinking about American interests, but also in the context of history and in the context of what we are trying to do as a nation, like what we should be doing in terms of our relationships overseas. Should they be heavily militarized as they are today? Or do we have to rethink some of the alliances we have, some of the relationships we have? Like what does a republic look like today in the 21st century, after 70 years of like this sort of consensus thinking that you mentioned. So I'm just so glad to know you, and glad that you're working and you're getting your PhD. And I imagine that we're going to see some great things from you. So I hope you'll come back on the show to talk about them.
Will do. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.